This episode of Now This Is Lit is brought to you by Audible. Check the link in the description to get your first Star Wars audiobook free. Everyone loves free things. Click that link. Do it. This show is also brought to you by our patrons. If you want to support the show in a different way, with just $1 a month, you can join our Patreon at patreon.com/StarWarsLitPod. You can get a sticker. You can get access to an exclusive show that we do every month that's wild and chaotic and fun and something you can only get by becoming a member of the Patreon. There'll be so many more perks very, very soon. But for now, do you want a sticker? Do you want a sticker that has a Now This Is Lit logo? Because it's fantastic and I love them. But I also want to give them away because there's just a stack of stickers on my desk. So if you want one, $1 a month. Patreon.com/StarWarsLitPod. A long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. You're listening to Now This Is Lit, a podcast about Star Wars books, the people who make them, and the readers who just can't get enough of them. I'm your host, Meg Dowell. I use she, her pronouns. The Rise and Fall of the Galactic Empire was our pick for Star Wars Book of the Year for 2024, and in celebration of that, two of my favorite historians are going to talk in depth about that book, my producer and the one and only Chris Kempshall. Enjoy.
All right, let's get into this.
Yeah, go for it.
All right, so I guess I will welcome you back to the show, even though this is the first time we've talked on this show.
Thank you for having me.
But this is we have talked before on my prior show, so
yes, yeah, 100%.
All right. Yeah, so yeah, we are here to talk once again about the Rise and Fall of the Galactic Empire. This beefy fella.
Book.
Yes, right here. So, I mean, regular listeners of this show will, of course, know that I have been gassing this book up for a while now.
You're the one.
Yes. So I have been just super excited about having this conversation. It's something that Meg and I have talked about for the show for a minute, so I'm glad that it has come together. And so to kind of set the stage for listeners for the conversation that we're going to have, you know, as probably regular listeners who've listened to this show know, I have a background in history. I have a PhD in it, much like our guest here, Chris Kempshall. And so we're going to have a conversation about Rise and Fall of the Galactic Empire that sort of talks about this as sort of a work of history, because of course it's an in-universe work of history. And so I want to sort of have the conversation the way that we would in our sort of real world, the way that you would talk about like a monograph and kind of dig into it.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah. So we're gonna kind of go through the stages again, kind of like breaking down the parts of the book the way that you would if you had just, you know, a real world history book about some moment in our past. And so where I want to start, I hadn't actually planned on starting here, but I think this is actually a better starting point than what I originally planned, which is where, again, if you were writing any other kind of history book, you would start, which is to, you know, set your topic.
Yes.
And so that's where I want to start. Basically, why the rise and fall of the Galactic Empire? How did you get to this topic?
I mean, it's something that had interested me anyway. Like even before kind of doing Battles that Changed the Galaxy, which is, you know, I think it's a book that we're going to talk about a little bit as we go through this because it is relevant. But, you know, I'm a historian. I'm a historian of the First World War and therefore kind of historian of the 20th century and the like. And for my sins, whenever I played like any form of like Star Wars multiplayer or kind of computer game or strategy game or something like that, you know, there is something fun about playing, you know, flying around in a TIE fighter or moving Star Destroyers around. So, you know, I had like a pre-existing interest in the Empire and I'm a historian. And you know, there was always part of me that was like, you know, God, it would be really interesting to do like a book about the rise and fall of the Galactic Empire. And then when having kind of moved into doing battles, that you know, when I was working on battles, there was a voice in the back of my head that was very much along the lines of, is there something in particular you're waiting for, Chris? You know,
Hmm.
whilst they've invited you into the building, what's the worst that can happen if you suggest this idea to them? The worst that can happen is that they say no, and therefore it's, you know, literally nothing has changed. But when I saw how we were approaching battles, which is an in-universe book, it's not as overtly in-universe as Rise and Fall, but what, you know, me, Amy Radcliffe, Cole Horton, and Jason Fry were doing with battles, you know, it does work as an in-universe. You know, we talk about stuff as if it's happening there. We talk about kind of like the impact that the wars have had on us and the galaxy as if we were there. And I flagged the idea up really early to David Fentiman at DK, but the more that I worked on battles, the more I thought actually there is something really, really interesting about this. And David Fentiman at DK also has a background in kind of art history and history, and archaeology and the like. So, you know, he's a humanities person, like we are. So he got it and he understood the appeal of it, because if you want to do like a big grand sweeping, you know, grand history, you know, with a capital G, capital H,
Yeah.
it kind of has to be about the Empire as the first starting point, because you know, as I've said in kind of academic things about Star Wars, the Empire is at the very center of Star Wars. You know, everything has
Hmm.
kind of orbits around the Empire, and it's such a perfect topic for this kind of grand sweeping narrative arc of history. Um, Also, just like the title, "The Rise and Fall of the Galactic Empire," sounds really good.
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
and you know, people talk about in kind of in, you know, in all sorts of things in academia and publishing and like about, you know, kind of the elevator pitch. Well, the title kind of is the elevator pitch. You don't you know, there's not an
Yeah.
inch of fat on that title. It says exactly what the book is. Um, so it was kind of from that starting point that I thought, you know, there's something really, really interesting to be done here. And in comparison with battles, that and I kind of said this based off of my kind of understanding, when I was at Celebration Anaheim and I was over there doing publicity for battles that changed the galaxy, whilst knowing that some of the early conversations of Rise and Fall were happening in the background, at that time. But my understanding of battles is that, particularly with that type of reference book, you're not there to show the audience something amazingly new. You're
Hmm.
there to enhance their viewing of A New Hope or The Empire Strikes Back or
Yeah.
Revenge of the Sith or whatever, which is absolutely fine. You know, they didn't hire us to change Star Wars.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, but with Rise and Fall, the possibility of showing the audience something they'd never seen before, or if not kind of changing Star Wars, even more dramatically than with battles, enhancing the way that they might, you know, I like to think, and I don't know if it's true, you know, and I'm the author, so I would say this. So it's, you know, it's very much up to the audience and the listeners and that to say if it's true or not. But I like to think that, for example, if you watch the Battle of Hoth in The Empire Strikes Back, and then you read Rise and Fall of the Galactic Empire, and then you go back and watch the Battle of Hoth in The Empire Strikes Back, I think you're going to get something very, very different, or something quite new out
Hmm.
of that. Which actually, you know, I don't tend to talk about the stuff that I did and didn't do in battles because it's a collaborative thing. But I can say I didn't do the Battle of Hoth in Battles That Changed the Galaxy, and the person who did had a very not dissimilar view of it than I did,
Hmm.
of what that meant. So being able to take some of those kind of early seeds and kind of push it a bit further to show people what this must look like if you were in it, was like so appealing to me, and so exciting to me as a both as an author, but primarily as a historian, I think.
All right, nice. I'm glad you brought up the Hoth chapter because we're going to come back to the Hoth chapter a
Yeah, I
little bit
thought we might.
later. Yeah, yeah. The Hoth chapter got me really jazzed and got me thinking a particular line of questioning, and but we'll get to that a little bit later. All right. All right, so yeah, so you know you've set up the you know you've set the topic out here of the
Yeah.
rise and fall of the Galactic Empire. You've sort of told the story about like your sort of background interest, sort of how you came to that. And then I guess sort of the next step there, you know, in putting together this history, putting together any history, like once you figure out your topic, is you
Yeah.
then kind of figure out your research questions,
Yes.
right? You're trying to figure out the questions you want to answer. So as you set out to start, you know, writing this book, or even maybe pre-writing as you started maybe like drafting or putting together an outline or whatever, like what were some of the questions that you were coming up with that you wanted to answer?
So there's one central one, and I know it's a central one because it's in the book. So for those of you, yeah, I've as a quick tangent before I even answer the question, for a while I've been saying to either friends or colleagues, and even on kind of podcasts like this, that I reckon I could use the introduction of the book to teach undergraduates or teach my students how to write historical essays,
Mm-hmm.
because Beaumont Kin is real dedicated to this. He lays out all of his sources, he talks about archivists, he talks about his position as a historian, and he talks about some of his research questions. And a really, really big one for me was, and we obviously in the book we phrased it in an in-universe way, and I think in the book it's phrased something along the lines of, the Rebel Alliance think they know why they won the war, but do we actually know why the Galactic Empire lost it? Because those aren't the same thing. And it is the type of thing that I have applied to like my real world history kind of study and teaching and research. So I used to teach a course at a university about tank warfare, which is not like hugely my thing, but sometimes you end up teaching stuff, and sometimes that's academia, kids. And I used to say to my students that, so the first time like the tank gets used in the First World War, the conclusions as to why it works are going to be very different depending on if you're British or if you're German. The British are going to have a sense of why they think the Germans are running away. The Germans are going to know why they're running away.
Mm-hmm.
And those two things may or may not be the same thing. So I thought that was basically my starting point, that let's approach this as if, understandably, because it's Star Wars and we've watched Star Wars, that the major focus of Star Wars is the rebel experience of the Galactic Civil War,
Yeah.
and the rebel experience of being in Star Wars. So the rebels are going to come away with a certain idea about why they're great, why they win the war, why they are successful. And some of it we see in the films and the novels, that like around the idea that the rebels have a really just cause, and that's what they've got the force on their side, they've got right
Mm-hmm.
on their side, and as a result they're going to win, which is fine, but that doesn't tend to actually be why why nations or sides win wars. um so my starting point was therefore, okay, so you know what, we'll assume that that's true, even though I think parts of the book argue that it probably isn't true. um but that doesn't answer why, what is the Empire's experience of fighting in the Galactic Civil War? Why does the Empire think it loses? Um, because obviously the First Order come back and they've got to have told themselves something. It's not going to be, wow, those guys were losers.
Yeah,
They're gonna
yeah.
come up with a bit more than that. So what is the Empire's understanding of itself in the Galactic Civil War? And if that's the central research question, then it also explains why the Galactic Civil War doesn't appear until halfway through the book, because you have to understand what the Empire is and what
Yeah.
the Empire thinks it is and what the Empire actually is, again, which are not the same thing. So as a result, the first kind of half of the book, the first two sections of the book, are about understanding how the Empire operates. What is the Empire? What does it do? Why does it do the things that it does? Why does it operate in the way that it does? Because all of these things are choices. The Empire chooses what it cares about. The Empire chooses what it spends its money on. The Empire chooses how it governs planets and people. Um, so that was kind of like a secondary kind of key research question. What is the Empire? How do we start to break it down? If, as this book is positioned, it's a revisionist history.
Mm-hmm.
There's a kind of an understanding in the book that in the years after the Galactic Civil War, the galaxy has told itself a story about the Civil War and about the Empire. And Beaumont Kin's now coming back after the First Order have arrived and been defeated and gone, well, we were way off.
Yeah.
So we actually need to go all the way, right back to the very start, down to the very grassroots level of the Empire, and start again, and actually re-examine all of this stuff, um, which is actually quite a fun way of doing it, because it means that um, everything gets to be new. everything gets to be new for the in-universe audience, and everything gets to be new for us, despite the fact that none of it's new because we've watched Star Wars.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was very much about that. What is the Empire? What does it do? And why does the Empire lose the war? It's not a question about how the rebels win it. What does the Empire, because you're never going to find a more lopsided,
Yeah.
one-sided shoe-in conflict on paper than the Galactic Empire versus like 12 people in a forest in Yavin. How could they possibly have lost this?
Yeah.
But the fact that we know that they do lose this, and Beaumont Kin knows that they lose it, means that there is a tension, there is a research question there that needs to be answered.
All right. Yeah. Yeah. That I love that framing of like, yeah, because so much around Star Wars is from that rebel point of view and
Yeah,
thinking about like how and why did the rebels win? But then
yeah,
there is the flip side, right? To have the winner, there must be the loser, and so it's like,
yes,
how and why does the Empire lose it all?
yeah. And the Rebel Alliance isn't actually in the book that much. I mean, obviously, at
Yeah.
various points when talking about battle odds and the aftermath and that bit, but it doesn't. It's not a history of the Rebel Alliance.
Yeah.
It's a history of the Empire, which means the rebels are only relevant when they're relevant, either in actual, the stuff that they're doing, or what the Empire conceives of the rebels being, or basically anybody who doesn't love the Empire is a rebel, which again is a definition which doesn't help the Empire and helps to explain a little bit about why they lose the war. Um, but yeah, to basically go, yes, I understand. We understand this is Star Wars is a story about the Rebel Alliance, but let's ignore them for a while and actually, really focus fully, in full widescreen, 4K on the Galactic Empire and what it is that they do.
Yeah. So, all right. So we've talked topic. We've talked. We've talked formulating these research questions in terms of what you do in this book. It is of course an in-universe history of the Galactic Empire, and
Yeah.
it's sort of this synthesis of all of this storytelling in this whole time, right? So it's an in-universe history of Star Wars. But I think the other thing, and this is where we're going to get to the Hoth chapter and a few other things. I think the other thing that at least particularly folks who aren't historians who might read this and sort of miss this is that it is also in parts an in-universe historiography of Star Wars.
Yes.
And so again, for folks who aren't familiar, who don't know the phrase, like what that
Who haven't wasted
like,
their lives on academia.
yes, exactly. What is historiography? So it's essentially the kind of one-liner of it is like it's the history of history, and so it's based. The idea is the sort of general premise, operating premise of historians is like if you want to understand like why does a thing happen? Why do people make some decisions? Why do they not make other decisions? Why do they have some options available to them or not? You have to understand the sort of broader context in which they live, social, political, economic, and you also have to understand the sort of the context of time of
Yeah.
when they are rooted and like what is going on in the world around them as these things are happening. So that's how you want to understand like events or people's motivations or like why nations go to war, etc. Related to that, coming off of that, which again sort of seems like intuitively a very straightforward notion, is that history itself is rooted in history. So
Yes.
the stories that we tell about the past are rooted within the particular context in which those storytellers, those history tellers are telling them. So that when people are writing about the past from whatever their vantage point, whether it is 2015, whether they're writing about some historical event in 2000 and 1980 and 1900, whenever it is, they are not simply looking at facts or looking at their primary source or whatever kind of objectively removed from their circumstances. They are also embedded in their particular time, what's going on around them, and that is acting as sort of a filter in terms of how they are interpreting moments further back in the past, why they might be looking at particular events and how they are interpreting them. Some of that may be in response to things that are happening in the moment, right? That they are using history as a way to say something about their particular
Yes.
present. And yeah, and so all of that is to say essentially is that history itself is this sort of changing thing, right?
Yes.
Right, as we go, forward in time or backward in time, the perspectives and interpretations that we have about people and about events in the past will change. There are perspectives that may have not been listened to in the past, or that may have been privileged in the past, that as we move forward, we start to say, well, we're going to bring in these other voices. And when we do that and we look at the same event A, all of a sudden we have kind of a different point of view on it now, and we have some nuance and complexity. So that all of that kind of falls under this umbrella of historiography, more or less. And so you do some of that work in this book. So there is, I remember maybe the first time it jumped out, it was at the start of one of the chapters. I don't remember which one I should have, but there's a part of beginning of the chapter where you basically do the clean Wehrmacht, but you do it to stormtroopers. And I was reading that, I was like, oh my God. Where you have this moment where it's like, oh, people thought that the stormtroopers were like honorable or not involved in the Empire's kind of worst atrocities. But now we look back and we're like, oh yeah, they were like, the rank and file totally knew like what they were doing, and they were totally participating. Yeah. And then, as you've already mentioned, the big kind of chapter where you really see sort of the kind of historiography meat happening is that Battle of Hoth chapter, where you sort of talk about how like it's seen as, and if you watch The Empire Strikes Back, you look at the Battle of Hoth and you're like, wow, this was a, slam dunk win for the Empire.
Yeah, they won that by a mile.
Yeah, like they find the base, they destroy it. They go, like the rebels go running. It just looks like an unambiguous win for the Empire. But then you go into the chapter and you're like, well, actually, if you dig a little bit deeper and you look at the kind of immediate aftermath, it actually ends up being this kind of this moment of unraveling, and where you really start seeing the cracks in the Empire that kind of end up exploding by the time you get to Endor.
Yeah.
And so I wanted you to talk a little bit about like how you sort of navigated both doing that kind of the history work of kind of narrating the past, but then also sort of that historiographical work in there of like showing the evolution of perspectives on these events.
Yeah, and I think one of the first points to kind of talk about, and something again that I've always kind of told my students, that the context is the text and the text is the context. As you were saying earlier on, the period in time in which a history book is written means that history book is partly about that period of time, regardless about what it's on. And one of the things, very, very early on when we were putting the idea together, is that this had to be set after episode 9. And Beaumont-Kin had to be writing this as a revisionist piece, because it had to be a response to the First Order and all of the awfulness that has just happened. And as the book goes on, you begin to see the extent to which that is impacting on Beaumont-Kin. So Beaumont-Kin absolutely had to be a part of his book, and the time period in which he's writing it absolutely had to be a part of his book. Because again, as I've said to students, history is also about historians, and therefore, the rise and fall of the Galactic Empire is also about Beaumont-Kin, and that's actually the kind of the element that me and Meg danced around when I first came on the podcast. The fact that we basically poker faced it out in the lead up to the book being released, because everybody went, "Oh, it's a history book," and it's like, yeah, I guess, but that's not all it is, because of the Beaumont-Kin arc in it, but because we kept a straight face, I don't think many people saw that aspect coming. So because it's a revisionist piece, it means that Beaumont-Kin gets to kind of argue against stuff that none of us have read because it doesn't actually exist, but is basically arguing at times against the assumptions that we have made whilst watching Star Wars. And the Hoth one is a really good example of it, because you're absolutely right. Nobody comes out of The Empire Strikes Back going, wow, the rebels did well. That's a strategic victory for them, maybe a tactical defeat, but probably a strategic victory, because it looks like they get absolutely smashed and flying away, and nobody's coming out of that in a good way. But if you do apply a historical lens to it and compare Hoth to other battles, I've read the diaries and letters and memoirs and all of like hundreds of soldiers from various wars, and they don't react well to having their lives wasted. It's not great for morale when they discover that actually there was a yawning chasm between what they thought they were doing and what the guys in charge thought was actually important. So when you have a situation where Vader goes, well, actually, we're just going to chase those guys. I don't really care if your Star Destroyer gets obliterated in an asteroid field, and however many thousands of people on board die. I'm only interested in the Millennium Falcon, which is fine for Vader. But if you apply a historical lens to that, that's a big problem for
Yeah.
everybody in the Imperial military when that realization comes that, a, nobody signs up into the Galactic Empire or fights in the Galactic Empire with, a real expectation that like Palpatine and Vader give a damn about Stormtrooper 1029 or whatever. But soldiers fighting wars generally have the assumption that decisions are being made to win the war. This is, a strategic decision, an order is given with the end point being to win the war. There's a First World War kind of 20th century historian called Hugh Strawn, who defines strategy as the use of the battle for the purpose of the war. And if you then look at Hoth, well, the second half of that battle is not for the purpose of the war. Nothing that's happening there is
Yeah.
designed to end the war. So as a historian looking at that, thinking, well, there is going to be a morale issue here. People are not going to react well to this because I know in the real world they don't react well to that type of thing. But they also don't react well to false dawns. The idea that, oh, Yavin's going to end the Galactic Civil War, and then some of the battles in the comics are going to end the Galactic Civil War, and now the Battle of Hoth's going to end the Galactic Civil War. And there's a slight element of, because it's Star Wars, because it's kind of pulpy sci-fi, there's a slight element of morning cartoon show of, oh, they got away, we'll get you next time, Gadget. That kind of level to it. But again, if you treat it as real, sooner or later those soldiers in the military are going to start going, and how many more times are we going to pass up the chance to win this war? How many more times am I going to have to dig deep? Because that's what happens in the real world.
Yeah.
You tell soldiers this offensive is going to win the war, and then when it doesn't, and the next one doesn't, and the next one doesn't, eventually they start to despair a little bit at it. So the Hoth gave me a really good opportunity to kind of showcase this kind of revisionism of changing the in-universe historiography of it, because the rebels probably tell themselves, God, Hoth was a disaster. We came this close to absolutely the apocalypse. But did they come that close to it? Because, Mon Mothma's not there, the Rebel fleet's not there. Yeah, losing Leia and Han and Luke and all of those people would have been a massive blow. And, losing Luke if he gets captured and turns to the dark side is definitely, not a good thing. But militarily, a big Star Destroyer gets blown up and another one gets blown up off camera, which is probably more than the entire population of Hoth. So there's no way you can spin that as a victory. So on that level is kind of showcasing revisionism. But what I also wanted to do, and one of the things I think people quite liked, I've seen loads of people being like, God, why is the stuff in the footnotes not real? Can you just write that? Because I really, really want to read it. Is Beaumont pulls in studies in the footnotes and mentions in kind of the text of the book other studies about the Empire or the Galactic Civil War or, Star Wars history, and says, you should read this because, this person is far more qualified to talk about it than I am. And they've talked about it in a really, really good way. Firstly, is a kind of a way of placing limits. Beaumont Ken is not a Superman. Ironically, he's probably a better historian than I am because he does, military and social and cultural and economic and industrial history, and he juggles all these things. I can't do all of that. But also for him to go there to show that he exists in a populated field, that he is not the first person to think about the Empire. And some of the stuff he brings in, he's like, this is actually really, really good. This should be better known. We should be using this as a cornerstone for understanding this. And quite often, and again by design, the stuff that he brings in or he points his fingers at is either written by non-humans or is not written by, white male humans who look like Beaumont Kin,
Yeah.
to say, actually, maybe we have privileged some of the or some studies and some historians who don't have the best platform to look at this stuff from. If you want to understand a history of the Twi'leks, you should probably read a historian written by a Twi'lek because they're gonna understand this better than I am. Um, and that actually there is a historiography of kind of history from below, grassroots history, that should be better understood within the galaxy. And I think that's also an opportunity to kind of showcase to the audience that, if you want to read a history about something, maybe actually start looking at historians of that thing or historians from that thing. Because that's a very good way of understanding kind of the hierarchy of historiography, in ways that are useful for us and is clearly useful for Beaumont.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. We'll talk about sourcing in a minute here. But yeah, I think the way that you kind of bring that up in the book is really good. I mean, the other chapter, to go off the points that you just talked about, like your whole chapter on atrocities and genocides,
Yeah.
really kind of goes into that because, if you even think about like in terms of like what we see particularly like on screen, we obviously get, in from the very first movies, like we get the destruction of Alderaan, where we
Yeah.
obviously we don't see Alderaan, but like we are coded as these are humans because Leia is our
Yes.
token Alderaanian, and so we just kind of you extrapolate out from that. Like so we have those visual moments. We are assuming probably Andor season 2 is going to give us the Gorman massacre. That's a lot of people, I think, from what we've seen in the trailer and what season 1 kind of tease up. It seems like we're going to probably get that because it's obviously pivotal to Mon Mothma leaving the Senate and all of that. But then we have the Geonosians, we have the Lasat, we have
Yeah.
these other non-human populations that sort of in universe in the in the in universe history of Star Wars sort of get written out, and they're obviously like contextually they're important as sort of a prelude to like how do you get to an Alderaan. Is there's actually all
Yes.
these populations that have gotten wiped out, but it is sort of through whether it's like anti-alien prejudice through literal cover-ups have kind of disappeared. But then even in some ways in Star Wars telling itself, like we kind of know of them at a remove, but like we don't actually, like we haven't seen like the wiping out of the Lasat. Like we haven't
No.
really seen the wiping out. Like we see the aftermath of what happens to Geonosis, but we don't really see like what literally happens in real time on Geonosis. So yeah, like bringing, I like the way that you do that in the book in terms of like bringing in these other like in universe perspectives
Yeah.
into telling this kind of more rounded history of the Empire.
Yeah. And one of the things with that, again, in regards to kind of historiography or kind of the role of a historian. Um, I think that kind of Beaumont clearly disagrees with, and I kind of disagree with as well. Or like a view of what it means to be as a historian is that you are dispassionate, you are
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
unbiased, you are balanced,
Yeah.
and you're not taking a side in that, which Beaumont Kin clearly takes a side in
Yes.
this. This is not an unbiased, balanced view of the Empire because what would that even look like? But there's sometimes a kind of the extension of that kind of misunderstanding of what it means to be a historian and what historians do, that suggests that groups or people who are part of the moment under study are not dispassionate enough to write about it,
Mm-hmm,
and
mm-hmm.
that Beaumont Kin might do a better history of the Imperial occupation of Kashyyyk than a Wookiee would, whereas Beaumont Kin takes a completely different position. Go, actually, firstly, that kind of balance thing doesn't exist. It's not a real thing, and it absolutely shouldn't be a real thing. But he also goes, because I've not had to live through this. I don't know what it means to be called these things, or to watch these things happen, or to have or to experience this. And as a result, I don't possess the ability to write about this. So go and read a Wookiees thing, or go
Yeah.
and read a Twi'leks thing, or um, these are the best people to write about it because they understand it on a level that I can't. And the only times when Beaumont really doesn't do that is when there's no one to talk about. There are no Geonosian historians left
Yeah.
because there are no Geonosians left. So, he will intervene and try and talk about it as best he can, and flags up, there are going to be limits to how far I can understand this. But he only really kind of gets into those things when there is no one to give voice to it themselves. So he will give
Hmm.
overviews and he'll give his interpretation and his analysis of it, but he will then direct the reader, the in-universe reader, to a study written by somebody who is better placed to write about it. Which is also an important part of being a historian, about recognizing where you fit in this grand scheme of things that you're trying to talk about.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. So we've talked about sourcing. So let's just get it. Let's keep the conversation going on sourcing here. Actually, before I do that, I got to turn on a light. I've sort of got like a Darth Sidious thing going on. Okay, that's better. All right. Leave this in, Meg. All right. So, yeah, so one of the things that kind of stands out, in this book is all the footnotes that you have in there, like all of these in-universe references to
Yeah.
different books or primary material, like stuff from archives and stuff, and like it even goes into like the little. I love the little insert of the pictures because like you have the picture, like the movie or TV stills, and it's like it's from this camera or like whatever,
Yeah.
like from wherever else. And so I wanted to sort of talk about sourcing both the process of kind of coming up with these in-universe sources, but then
Yeah.
also your own sourcing in writing this book in terms of what you look to, because you're telling this kind of cohesive story of the empire, of its rise and fall, that has been told across many different mediums, movies, TV, books, comics, that as best as the story group has tried, there are there are points of of contention, and there's places where one thing says something and then something else says something else, and you're trying to make sense of this sort of like iterating of Star Wars,
Yeah.
of them building on this story, then going back, and then something gets changed over here, or something gets added on, and now you're trying to kind of fit the pieces together. So talk a little bit more about like both of those aspects of sourcing, of like coming up with the in-universe sourcing, but then also you doing your own sort of research and sourcing for this book.
So the in-universe stuff, the kind of the primary question when we started this, like super early on when we were kind of figuring out the nature of the book, was the question: how does Beaumont-Kin know the thing that Beaumont-Kin, or know the things that Beaumont-Kin knows if
Yeah.
Beaumont-Kin hasn't watched Star Wars?
Hmm.
Because I have a massive advantage over Beaumont-Kin in that not only have I watched Star Wars, I can watch it whenever I want. Whereas Star Wars doesn't exist in Star Wars. Um, so that meant that we had to figure out how we would take events, anything that's happened in Star Wars, that we wanted to talk about, and have it survive in some form long enough for it then to be picked up by Beaumont Kin. That wasn't just, oh, I heard a rumor that the Emperor could shoot lightning from his hands. You actually have to root that in
Yeah.
something. Um, and because, I spent a lot of time in archives of all kinds of different archives, I have an understanding of the type of stuff that does exist,
Hmm.
and make its way through. But also, looking at Star Wars, the types of things that are definitely not going to exist. There is nobody taking minutes of a meeting between the Emperor and Darth Vader, because
Yeah.
wow, that person's going to be super dead. The second like, this turns into anything beyond, hey, Darth, how's it going? The second you get into any details, that guy's going to die. Because you don't get to sit in on the meetings between the Emperor and Darth Vader. So that kind of discussion between Palpatine and Vader in like The Empire Strikes Back, that's not going to make it. It's you're not going to find that as something that that Beaumont King can pull out. Um, but I know the types of things that do. You know, Meetings, actual kind of military minutes survive. Some first-hand testimony survives, economic stuff survives, battle plans survive in various forms. So we could convert moments from Star Wars into, and we know that the Empire is a state that clearly loves producing paperwork. We see it in Andor when Cyril gets to sit in his cube. Everybody around him is producing reams and reams of paperwork that no one's ever going to read, because that's not
Yeah.
how things like the Empire exist. They produce bureaucracy for bureaucracy. But it meant that we could stick a lot of kind of internal Imperial operations stuff in random reports that the Empire generates. And then, say, well, that survives in an archive because, again, where else is this stuff going to exist if it's not in an archive? But there's also stuff that we really, really wanted to put, or I thought actually this is really important. The fact that there's not going to be a record in the Imperial Archive, Imperial Archives, Emperor Palpatine ability to shoot lightning from his hands. That's not going to be there.
Yeah.
But Luke Skywalker sees it happen. Rey sees it happen. So you can kind of then imagine a situation after the Battle of Endor that Luke Skywalker is going to have a debriefing, because that's how militaries work in the real world. So presumably it would be how it works in the Rebel Alliance, that somebody's going to sit him down and go, so we need to find out exactly what happened on the Death Star. Tell us about the Emperor. And he's like, wow, he shoots lightning from his hands. Can you believe that? So again, we could kind of take the assumptive step of what happens next, for things like that. And then occasionally you'd get things that I thought would be a useful way of considering something based off of a different element of it. So in A New Hope, Tantive 4 gets captured, and Leia marches up to Darth Vader and goes, "What the heck, dude? The Senate isn't going to sit still for this. You need to let me go, or you're going to be in an awful lot of trouble." Which is actually very, very interesting about
Yeah.
the Imperial Senate, because the assumption I think a lot of people have is that it's a toothless body, but that can't be true if the first thing that Leia says to Vader when she marches up to him is like, do you understand what the Senate's going to say about this? There has to be some form of bite behind the Senate's bark, if that is true. So how to convert that into something
Mm-hmm.
that can be used by Beaumont Kin? And we did a thing where basically Beaumont Kin talks about, there's a moment in an early battle with the Resistance where he's afraid, and he asks Princess Leia, how do you deal with this level of fear? And she tells him this story, which is designed to be, like, I was terrified of Darth Vader because he's, look at him, he's really scary. But I faked it. I faked confidence until I felt it. And this is a scenario when I did that. And from that, Beaumont Kin takes the idea that, okay, you can master your fear. But also, this is a really interesting examination of the Imperial Senate. I'll have to write this down at some point in the future and use it in
Yeah.
something. So occasionally we fudged it for useful historical purposes. Where the interesting overlap then comes with the other part of the question, what did I use as sources, is that if you're going to treat Star Wars as real, this is an in-universe history book. All of this stuff has happened. There is no
Mm-hmm.
differentiation for people living in Star Wars for things that happened in Return of the Jedi versus things that happened in a random episode of Rebels or a graphic
Yeah.
novel. It's all real. Um, and also, in our point of view of looking at Star Wars, it all happened in the past because Star Wars happened a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. So it's all random historical stuff. Which means you just have to apply equal weight to
Mm-hmm.
everything. It's all just as important as everything else. And some of the stuff that happens in either the films or the graphic novels or the TV series can be pretty wacky. Pretty kind of weird and pretty kind of out there. But it all exists in a universe where the most important man in the galaxy can shoot lightning from his hands. And if we take that as a starting point of it being, as a thing that is a reasonable thing to happen, then it doesn't matter that some of the other wacky stuff happens, because it's no wackier than the Emperor can shoot lightning from his hands. So we kind of just cast an incredibly wide net. Everything was relevant. You know,
Yeah.
Rebels was relevant, Clone Wars was relevant, graphic novels were relevant, the computer game Star Wars Squadrons was relevant. All of this stuff was a primary source, as relevant and important as anything else. And admittedly, some of those things contradict each other. You know, there are things where you go, well, how can X be true if Y is also happening at the same time? And in the introduction, Beaumont King kind of addresses that by saying, you know, there's going to be a time in the future when some of this might seem outdated or contradictory, or, you know,
Hmm.
we'll learn something new that makes us think, well, then actually, how could this have been the thing that I've said be true? And that's fine, because actually that's how history works. That's how
Yeah.
writing history works. At some point, we'll uncover a new archive and go, well, actually, if this is true, then how can this be true about the Battle of Verdun, or the Battle of Stalingrad? We now have to reconsider these things, and it's fine, because we'll always know more in the future, and there'll always be sources that contradict. And there are moments in Rise and Fall where either Beaumont is trying to make sense of what might seem like competing things, like the Battle of Hoth, but also the chapter on the Battle of Endor, when he's got competing sources about what happened or whatever has happened in the room when all of the admirals and the captains get together, and Piet tells them how this is going to go down. And some of those sources say, oh yeah, no, it was fine. Everybody was super chill about it. And some of those sources go, people were livid. And Bowen was like, well, how can these sources that contradict each other, how can we find a cohesive view of history? Um, and that's partly, you know, that's what historians do. They look at things and they go, well, these widely contradict each other. But if we look at some of the stuff around it, I reckon I can come down on one side of or the other. And I think if you read that chapter, it becomes clear by the end of it what Beaumont Kin thinks has happened in that room, but there's no way to prove it definitively. And if you take Star Wars material in the same spirit, you are going to read stuff and says, you know, oh, this happened, but simultaneously, apparently, this happened, and it's really hard to figure out. You know, well, how can I tell which of these is canon? Well, they're both canon, but they might not necessarily both be accurate. It's fine for that to be the case when you're dealing with historical sources, which we are
Yeah.
dealing, because all of Star Wars happened in the past.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, I love that. I think I want to underscore something that you were talking about, particularly in the context when you're talking about the in-universe sourcing, is this element of like in history that like your sources are your story in a lot
Yeah.
of ways, right? That is like if you're going to say like if you're going to make some sort of like claim or some sort of statement about some event or like some people or something, like there is immediately the question of like what are you pointing to like as
Yes.
your proof of that, like it's got to be in like there's got to be a document, there's got to be a narrative, there's got to be like something that
Yeah.
backs that up. And
And
yeah,
oh, go on.
no, I was gonna say, and then like I mean part of what that means like that, yeah, like that story's going to change, and like that story, like there are stories that you sometimes can't tell because it's like records didn't serve, like either like somebody didn't make those records
Yeah.
or there was a fire and they got destroyed, or like somebody gave their papers to an archive but it's like these aren't public until 2050, and it's like, oh well, I guess we're gonna have to wait till 2050 to tell that story because we
Yes.
literally can't see the papers. And so it's like, yeah, it's like what you have in front of you is the story you can tell. That is the like that is the wall you are going to hit, and
Yes.
that is going to change as you find things, as new things get made, as things become public that weren't public before.
Yeah. And there's two aspects to that. One that is important for the readers, and one that's important for Beaumont Kin. So the one that's important for the readers is because Beaumont Kin doesn't have access to all of the information, because again, he hasn't watched Star Wars. It means sometimes when he makes an argument or kind of tries to draw a conclusion, he's not he's not right.
Mm-hmm.
There's elements like I think in the chapter in the Clone Wars where Belmonkin is trying to figure out what triggered Palpatine to go, you know what, Order 66 now, and he doesn't know what it is, and he tries to kind of build an argument around it because he hasn't watched Revenge of the Sith and therefore doesn't know what it is that's triggered
Yeah.
Palpatine's decision to go now. But what I want the audience to take from it is an element of reading it going, oh, that kind of fun feeling of, I know something that Beaumont Kin doesn't know. I know that this is about, what happens with Anakin. It's what happens if, when Count Dooku dies. It's about what happens when the Jedi come to arrest him. But if I didn't know those things, maybe I draw a conclusion not that dissimilar from Beaumont based on the information that he's laid out for me, because Beaumont is very, very diligent in kind of trying to source all of his arguments. So that element of showing the audience when Beaumont is wrong, but also giving them a sense of why Beaumont is wrong, and maybe actually the audience would agree with Beaumont in universe based off of the information that's available. And the other side of that is that Beaumont at points particularly later in the book talks about in the aftermath of the Galactic Civil War, and even during the First Order, that there are people who are clearly still pro-imperial. There are pro-imperial
Yeah.
historians. There are people with kind of pro-imperial and pro-First Order allegiances, and he talks a little bit in the conclusion about he doesn't know how he's going to go back and talk to his old colleagues who didn't get involved, who sat and did the dispassionate historian thing and didn't take a side. I'm part of in my head of kind of writing this and making sure that all the footnotes are in there, is that Beaumont is aware that there are people in the field who will try and pick holes in this. And you
Hmm.
go, oh, you've misidentified a source, or you've misrepresented an argument, and they're like, and therefore we can disregard your entire book. We don't have to
Yeah.
read it. We don't have to take its message. And the message is super important to Beaumont. It's the most important thing of the book, what he's trying to get people to understand. So he has to go to like the maximum level of sourcing and diligent record keeping,
Hmm.
because he's aware of what the stakes are. That, there are going to be people who are desperate to write this whole thing off because he makes an error in a footnote, and therefore none of it can be reliable. So he has to lay it all out because it has to be above reproach.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. I like that. I like that the point you bring up about like him having to make conjectures or like places where he's wrong. I remember like I think one thing that people point out when the book first came out of an instance. I mean, it's a little one, but it's like where he identifies Sly Moore as a Powan. I think that's it.
Yeah, possibly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's that as opposed to an Umbaran. And like that's a sort of like in universe moment. It's like, okay, yeah, like he gets her species wrong, because it's like like that's something that can happen if you are working at that sort of remove.
Yeah. It's a big
For
galaxy.
Yeah, it's a big galaxy. All right, so where I want to talk now is to sort of talk to get back sort of to a point that you brought up a little bit earlier when we were talking about sort of historiography, is that you made this point about like that history is as much about like the historian who's writing it as it is about like the actual events in the past that it's describing. And so I wanted to sort of like have you talk a little bit about, as you're writing this in universe history, the sort of influences on you in terms of historians in crafting the story that you did. Because I think like again, like if you know to look for it, it pops up in places
Yeah.
throughout there. There's like, I'm thinking about like there's the chapter on the imperial state where you talk about like the organization, the bureaucracy, and you do kind of like Ian Kershaw, like working towards the Fuhrer kind of stuff, and you're sort of like bringing that in. So I want you to talk a little bit about like who are the folks that sort of like filtered through as you were telling this story that you might have been either direct influences or more just like kind of secondhand, kind of indirect, that influence like how your history telling happened in this book.
Yeah, so I mean, you've already flagged up one of them. One of them
Mhm.
there with that section, and there are no, there's nothing in there that, if you're not, again, I say, if you haven't wasted your life in academia and history, there's nothing in there that is detracting from your enjoyment of the
Yeah,
book if you don't get it. But there are little historian Easter eggs in there for basically for people like us, just to kind of,
Ilupatan.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yes.
yeah. To put those types of things in there. And it's interesting because sometimes people think that the book is called The Rise and Fall of the Galactic Empire, and there are books with very similar titles
Hmm.
in the real world that people go, oh well, obviously that's an inspiration, and maybe so, but not maybe necessarily as much as you might think of. So a book that often gets overlooked in these kind of discussions about the real world equivalent of Rise and Fall is a book by Paul Kennedy, The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers,
Hmm.
which is a book that I used a lot for kind of during my PhD and during the writing of the book about my PhD thesis about kind of the European great powers in the lead up to kind of during the 19th century in the lead up to the First World War and the like. There's also a historian who is basically like my historian hero, and sadly she's not with us anymore, um, called Elizabeth Greenhalgh, and she wrote a book. She was a French historian, a historian of France in the First World War, and wrote a book about in a Cambridge University Press series, which was kind of countries at war or armies at war or something like that. And she wrote the book about France and the French army at war. But that book about France and France's and his army at war also includes stuff about industry and politics and
Hmm.
society and like civil society and the relationship between the people and the army. And I love that book, and it's a
Hmm.
really really important book to me. So that is an inspiration to me, not necessarily in a way that you could kind of hold them up next to each other and go, oh, I can, this
Yeah,
paragraph
yeah.
in Rise and Fall translates perfectly over into Elizabeth Greenhalgh's book about France, but the spirit of it is important to me. That kind of element that you can't understand armies unless you understand industry. You can't understand industry unless you understand civil society. You can't understand civil society unless you understand culture. These things are important. There is the part of me that sometimes kind of gets a little frustrated at the field of military historian that focuses only on battles.
Hmm.
So, well, battles are irrelevant unless you understand the nations waging them. In the sense, and it brings us back to a point I made earlier on that the Galactic Civil War doesn't appear until section 3
Yeah.
of the book because it's meaningless without the first two parts of the book that explain what the Empire is. So Elizabeth Greenhalgh was a big inspiration on me for that. Um, another big one for me is Paul Fussell, who wrote his book. I'm gonna mangle the title slightly because it's late, but it's kind of Great War, Modern Memory, which is he kind of writes in the 1960s, and it's a book that a lot of First World War historians hate, because it's not history. And to be fair to Paul Fussell, he says, like in the introduction of that book, this I am not a historian. This is not a history book. It's a book about kind of literature and culture, but he writes it after the Second World War, as a war that he kind of participates in. And he goes back beyond the last war to the previous war to try and make sense of the First World War again, based on his own experience and like. And for me, again, the spirit of what Beaumont Kin is doing is not that different from what Paul Fussell is trying to do. Of going, we've just lived through an awful, awful thing. Maybe we need to go back to the previous awful thing and re-examine some of this to try and make sense of the thing that we've just lived through. So again, it's not the kind of the case that you could hold Fussell and Beaumont Kin up side by side and go, oh, I can see where the crossovers are.
Yeah.
But a lot of my interaction with kind of historians and the historiography and what I'm trying to transmit to the reader is not a kind of I've taken a historical event or I've taken a historian and I've Star Warsized them, because
Yeah.
I haven't really. There are
Hmm.
points when people
Right.
can kind of get comparisons, but I wasn't trying to take everything and then turn it into Star Wars. What
Yeah.
I was trying to do was to give the audience a sense of what it feels like to be a historian doing these things, the type of considerations the historians make, but also what it feels like to go into an archive and uncover something awful, what it feels like to try and make sense of competing historiography, what it feels like to undertake these big things. Because that's actually a slightly more, to my mind, it's a more interesting thing, and it's a type of thing that I don't think, again, audiences who haven't done historical research, it's not the type of thing they're going to have come across before
Yeah.
because they haven't done it, and therefore they don't know what it feels like. And I wanted Beaumont Kin to show them what it feels like, which again is why Beaumont Kin is so present in in the book, in that he's in the same way like R2D2 and C3PO are the main characters of Star Wars. They're the eyes through which we watch Star Wars. They must have the most screen time across the saga. In that Beaumont Kin is the way through which we experience history and the Galactic Empire. Um, and we experience it through him feeling it and transmitting what that feels like to us. And there are historians who have, like Paul Fussell and others who have done that. And then you also get like public historians. I've always had a very kind of odd relationship with AJP Taylor, who's a like the first public historian in the UK in the 1960s. And he writes about the First World War, but he's writing about the First World War in the 1960s. So is he talking about the First World War, or is he not talking about the First World War?
Yeah.
But he was one of the first people to try and make history accessible, to kind of, take it out of academia of the like that, the ivory tower aspect, and deliver it in a form that people could understand. And I've tried to take elements of that writing style and that kind of that approach, because Beaumont is writing this for ordinary people. He says it repeatedly, this is for the galaxy, this is for
Yeah.
ordinary people. And that's a whole field of history, public history, that I, was trying, as a public historian, trying to draw upon, the and stand on the shoulders of those who've gone, who've actually done it in the real world, and then try and translate that in a sense that people would recognize and get the gist of, whilst also bearing in mind that Beaumont isn't writing this for us. He's writing it for Rhodians and Twi'leks and survivors of Gorman and Commonorians and Chandrillans and all of these other people. That's who he's writing it for, and therefore he has to make this a broad, publicly accessible history.
Yeah, exactly. I want to actually come back to that point about public history and kind of end our conversation on that point. But just to go back to a couple points you said before, where you were talking about like Beaumont as being like the eyes through which we're seeing all this, and the sort of his own process of discovery, and like that sort of historical process. Like, we talked earlier, we started off by talking earlier on in this conversation about sort of research questions. And then later on, we went into like talking about sourcing. And I think just to sort of like connect those two parts of it is that there's sort of like an interplay there in terms of like the historical process. Like, you go in and like you formulate your research questions, and you may have had like some amount of reading. You might have like some amount of like primary material that is kind of that you've gotten into, and that is kind of informing like, okay, like I want to look into these things, I want to answer these questions. But then it's like you get into the archive, and all of a sudden it's like you might start discovering that like, okay, some of these questions I can't actually answer. Like the materials just don't exist to answer these questions. Or you get the answer and you're like, well, actually it's not really that interesting of an answer.
Yeah.
Or you get in and you realize like, oh, there's actually all these other stories, there's all these other stuff happening here that is as interesting, or like maybe is more important than the questions I was asking, or like I didn't even think to ask that because I didn't know that was there. And so all of a sudden you're like you're changing the questions that you're answering, and you're going in different directions. I mean, I know I've like if I read like if I went back and read like my dissertation proposal, like it was I don't know exactly what it was, but it was like completely different from the final product in terms of like, like I'm going to focus on these things, or I want to answer these questions. And then I actually got into the archive, and all of a sudden it's like, whoa, like it's like the real story's over here. So yeah, that sort of back and forth there,
yeah,
is a big part.
It is a big part, and there's a point in the genocide chapter, which is effectively the payoff of the first half of the book, where Beaumont gets blindsided in the archive. He goes in thinking he knows what he's getting himself into, and then discovers, to his kind of shock and horror, that he'd made an assumption about his understanding of the Empire, and it turns out that the reality is much, much, much worse, and tells him an awful lot more about the Empire than he'd seen going in, which is also kind of based off of an experience that I know, certainly myself, and I imagine you and like multitudes of historians have, of being surprised in the archive, or being shocked or being upset in the archives, all of those things. It's always a thing you're not quite expecting, that you suddenly go, oh, actually, wait, hang on. Either this changes what I thought, or I didn't see this coming, or yeah, exactly what you're saying. Now I need to reconsider all of the things about it. And you kind of see that play out in Beaumont as he kind of goes through parts of the book, because in my mind he's writing it in a chronological kind of linear fashion, and you can see at that point when he suddenly starts reflecting backwards on the stuff that he's already been writing about, and then what the kind of conclusions that he then applies to the Empire going forwards from this revelation that he finds in the archive. But in the kind of the outside universe aspect of that was something that we discovered also quite early on, is that we don't, there's loads about the Empire we don't know, or that we didn't know when we were writing Rise and Fall, because so much of it is based on audience assumption of what we
Hmm.
assume the Empire, they're a bunch of awful scumbags. Of course they're going to do awful scumbag things. So, presumably they're telling, they're brainwashing children in schools. That feels like the type of thing that the Empire had done. But we haven't actually seen it in any great detail. And there's
Yeah.
loads of parts, particularly in the early stages of the book, that just didn't exist. It was kind of either a throwaway comment here, which was never actually fleshed out, or kind of bits of weird backstory that didn't entirely tie together. So for us in the early writing stage, and God Story Group did so much heavy lifting for me in the early periods, was trying to actually figure out what do we know about the Empire that we can
Hmm.
start hanging any of this stuff on, in a sense that's broad enough that we're not going to handcuff everybody for the next 15 years to the stupid thing the historian wrote in his book, but also is concrete enough that we can point to an example that Beaumont King can talk in detail about. And therefore we had to build a lot of the inner workings of the Empire, because as we were kind of discovering it as we were going forward, there was these huge gaps in actual defined reality of the Empire, which is the type of thing that Andor has done so well, not only in filling in the gaps, but also playing on those gaps in that we just don't know what what it's like to be in the Empire, to be in Andor's point of view, like kind of perspective, or what it would be like for people living on a planet like Ferrix, until we see it on Andor, which means it's amazing and it's gripping, and it's one of the reasons why Andor's just the best. But it plays on the fact that we just don't know anything about the lived experience of the Empire, so we had to build it,
Yeah.
which is like the equivalent of one of these archival gaps, or one of these
Hmm.
knowledge gaps, or one of these things go, actually it's really hard to answer this because we don't know anything, and the records don't exist to kind of footnotes. So out of universe we then had to create them to an
Hmm.
extent that Beaumont King could then reference them, or not,
Yeah.
if we decided actually we're going to put a block in here to impede Beaumont's progress.
Right. Right. So, you talked a few minutes ago about like this being in universe a work of sort of public history, that he is writing
Yeah,
this for a kind of general audience to kind of give them this broad sweeping story of the Galactic Empire that is kind of comprehensive, both in terms of like, you know, breaking down like all these different aspects of the empire, but then also in terms of like its chronology of going all the way back and, up to the roughly kind of contemporary present of Beaumont.
yeah.
And so I wanted to sort of end on like, have you just like your own self in like writing this and putting this together in the aftermath as publisher, like have you given thought about the in universe reception of this book? Because like I mean, one thing I've said this sort of semi jokingly about the prequels in particular, like that part of the story. But I mean, obviously, other parts of the story too. Is like the prequels in particular. Like if you just like write down like what happens in the prequel trilogy, it reads like the most bananas conspiracy theory. Like it's basically like, oh, like if QAnon is true, like if someone comes out and is like, yeah, there is this evil cabal, like yeah, like that happened. Like
Yeah,
that's essentially what he's like. If you think about those early chapters, what he's laying out, it's like, yeah, the emperor was part of this dark cult. That people thought were gone for a millennia, and he, rigged this war so that he could rise to power. Like it sounds bananas
yeah.
if you just read this. And so, like, have you thought about like this book going out into the galaxy and people picking this up and reading this, like this
Yeah.
narrative, this story, this case that he's making?
I think, I imagine that Beaumont is desperately hoping, because he says it various times, he's viewing that this is an act of necessity, that his message is going to get across. Um, and one of the things that I think he does to try and best circumvent some of that, because you're right, like yeah, the Chancellor was two people at once, and one of them was evil, and one of them was a nice senator, and then it turned out they were both the same person. They could shoot lightning from their hands. Is to almost to extent to go, and it's irrelevant. Like it doesn't matter
Mm,
if Palpatine can shoot lightning from his hands. Palpatine's not the guy who's going to kick your door in at 3 o'clock in the morning.
yeah.
Palpatine's not the guy who's going to take your passport away. Palpatine's not the guy who's going to, seize your business. Who cares if Palpatine can shoot lightning from his hands? It's not that important to the Empire. Is that he tries and grounds it very much in kind of lived experience of what this will mean for you when the Empire comes to your house. in that sense, I think as a method of getting it across. And he tries to make it as kind of as relatable as possible, particularly in the aftermath of the First Order. But the other aspect of obviously kind of looking at it from an out of universe thing is, there's very little narrative potential in having the First Order defeated and Beaumont Kim writing this book and then everybody reading it and the aftermath of going and everybody lived happily ever after in a system of good governance. And you know what? It was never a problem anymore because all of that was solved and everybody decided to learn the lessons that Beaumont Kim suggested and the lessons of the past and, make a film trilogy out of that. Because there's no narrative excitement, there's no
Yeah.
narrative potential. Which is what I used to say sometimes about legends in kind of other stuff that I've done, that there is no exciting story to be written of, oh, there's this terrible threat to the New Republic, but they formed a steering committee and then a funding group, and they solved it through responsible government. It meant that Leia, Han, and Luke didn't have to jump in the Millennium Falcon and go off to save the day. Because God, that's boring. That's it's not exciting to read. It's not exciting to see on screen. But I think what makes it work in that dramatic kind of tension of particularly of the end of the book is that Beaumont Kin is not possessed with a great deal of hope at the end of Rise and Fall. I say that he's hoping for hope. So, there's
Hmm.
firstly a feeling that it might be too late for Beaumont Kin, but also that it's not clear if he believes the galaxy can do these things, but he really, really wants them to. And
Hmm.
actually, that's quite a good reflection on this type of history, of that when you write it, you don't get to know the impact that it's going to have, and you don't get to know if
Yeah.
the impact it's going to have is the impact that you wanted it to have.
Yeah.
Um, and for Beaumont Kin, a big part of it, it was enough to write it that he has said what he wants to say, and he's made as clear as possible he thinks the dangers are and what the repercussions should be and what he thinks should come next. And all of this has been quite clear, great emotional, mental, physical cost to Beaumont Kin. He's not in a great place at the end of the book, and he's kind of semi-martyred himself through writing for this. And in a similar thing to, if we look at Andor season one, and I've said online that the hill I will die on for Andor season one, unless Tony Gilroy obviously does it in a far better way than I would, because he's far better at this than I am, is I never want to hear about Kino Loy ever again, because it's perfect. Exactly. Leave him on that ledge. He, as people have been saying, and I've been kind of joking with friends, he's Schrodinger's Gollum. Um, he exists perfectly in the quantum moment on that ledge of he both escapes and gets captured, and he lives and he dies, and all of those things are perfect. It's fine for us not to know. In
Yeah.
that, for the moment, because I have no idea what's coming. Lucasfilm are not going to tell me what the plot of the Ray film is, or anything like that. I don't know what the galaxy is going to look like. So for just Beaumont Kin, in that moment, the moment he clicks send on the HoloNet and sends this book out to the galaxy, all outcomes are possible. It has the exact outcome he wants, or people ignore it, or it has no outcome, or
Yeah.
something in between. And all of those things are happening at once until we find out what actually happens, which is what happens when you release a history book. You
Yeah.
don't know how it's going to be received. I had no idea. Me and DK and Lucasfilm, we hoped that people would like Rise and Fall,
Hmm.
but we didn't know. We didn't know
Yeah.
what people were going to connect with in it. We didn't know what they were going to get out of it. So the book was released, and then the 4th of July over here, when the book was released in UK, happened, and then the 7th or the 9th or whatever it was in the US happened, and people were doing reviews and that on it, but we sat here and we waited to see what
Hmm.
happened when people got their hands on it. And the same thing is happening to Beaumont Kin right now, constantly, every day, because we don't know how it's been received yet, and we don't, and maybe we'll never know.
Yeah.
And that alone, I think, is actually kind of beautiful in its own way.
I like that. I like that way of thinking about it. All right. Well, this has been a fantastic conversation. This is exactly what I wanted out of this conversation.
God, I hope the audience got something out of this.
Yes, yeah, we don't know. This is going to go out on, I don't even know when this is going out, but like we are right now ourselves in that quantum state of not knowing what the reception is going to be and whether people like it. But I hope they do. If people have not read the book, podcasting famously a visual medium, you don't see me holding up the book.
No, but it's there.
But it's there. Go read this book. It's so good. And it's so important. And I think, I really think, like, if you are a Star Wars fan, you gotta read this book. It is so good, and you're gonna learn so much. And like you talked about, like, it is gonna change the way that you look at and think about different characters, different moments that, like, up to this point, like, you think you've known, like how, like what this means or like why this is important. Like, this book is gonna change your mind on some things. So get it, read it, engage with it, recommend it to other people. So
I support all of this message.
Yes.
As presumably would Beaumont.
Yes. So I'll give you the space now as we're wrapping up. Anything you want to plug, where people can find you, etc.
Nothing I can think of really to plug. As you said, Rise and Fall exists in all good bookshops. Hopefully. So by all means, read the book. I exist on all forms of social media, although much less so these days on some. They've become increasingly problematic as time has gone past. So, Blue Sky you can find me on, for example. Instagram you can find me on. If I'm doing like history stuff, I'll probably be talking about it on there. If anything fun ever happens, I imagine I'll talk about it on there. But yeah, there's nothing I can think of on the horizon that's immediately going to be like, wow, go run over to my Blue Sky and find out about it there. But yeah, if you want to hear more about or see more about the type of stuff I do as a historian, then I imagine you'll find it on there.
All right. Well, thank you, Chris, for this conversation, and thank you for writing this book.
Thank you very much for having me on.
Now This Is Lit is part of the Faraway Fandom Network. It is produced by Davor and written, hosted, and edited by me. Jose Jimenez designed our podcast art. You can keep up with the show on Substack, and Now This Is Lit, and find the show wherever you get your podcasts. There are so many ways you can support the show, and all of those ways are linked in the show description. The newest way is to become a member of our Patreon. For $1 a month, you can get access to an exclusive show and a sticker. And if we get 500 people to support the Patreon per month, I can hire an editor. That would be great for me, and maybe for you too. So if you'd like to support the show with just $1 a month, you can do it that way. Or you can just keep listening and sharing the episodes. That is also helpful, and I appreciate it. For more book reviews and Star Wars Book Celebration, follow Star Wars Book Reviews on Instagram and TikTok.